You have to be very careful about the information that you let in about complex PTSD and how to heal it, because a lot of what people say about it is wrong. And I'll tell you why. Now, I'm talking about beliefs that people have about trauma and healing that are going to misinform you and disempower you and hurt your chances of getting free from ever healing from this thing. And you can heal from it, all right? So in this video, I'm going to tell you the 5 mistakes people make around their complex PTSD. And I'm going to show you how to not make those mistakes, how to adopt a more successful strategy that will help you get where you're trying to go. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please hit that button. It really does help us here. Okay, number 1 mistake that you don't want to make is don't make your CPTSD your identity, all right? The trauma in your life happened to you, but it is not you. You are not your trauma. You are a complete, full human being who had some bad stuff happen to you. And that stuff affected you and it caused an injury. But I'm going to invite you to believe with all your heart that it's an injury and not an identity. And that healing, I want you to know this in your bones, healing is possible. It's possible for you to heal the brain changes that happen to you. It's possible for you to change the behavioral patterns that so many of us end up with after living a life with that brain injury. The brain injury produces something called dysregulation. Dysregulation makes it very hard for us sometimes to process information and emotions. They come in funny, they come out funny, and it complicates how we get educated. It complicates the way we have relationships. And we end up feeling really bad and like we're never going to be okay. But you know what? You can become somebody who learns well. You can become somebody who has a good relationship because you are you. You are not your trauma. So my approach is to heal the symptoms caused by the trauma in the past. If you can take your focus and put it on the symptoms, then you've just taken one giant step towards disidentifying from your trauma. When I first started to heal, I was going to a 12-step program for families of alcoholics. And technically, I am an adult child of an alcoholic. That is true. But I'm not really a child, and the alcoholic has not been alive for 30 years, so really, I can't say that I'm affected by that directly anymore. I definitely was hurt as a kid, and I think that did cause some dysregulation and some attachment problems for me, and that all manifested as my CPTSD. So that happened. These things are real, but I was able to heal those symptoms without ever bringing my mom back to life. My mom died about the same month that I went to my first 12-step meeting and that I was also shown how to do this daily practice that helped me so much. You know, that's not a coincidence. Her dying prompted me to go get help for a lot of pain that I had about how it had been growing up and how really neglected I had been and how much she had not been available to protect me from abuse from other family members because of her drinking. So my first 6 months or so going to meetings, I was crying every day, which is normal and healthy. I was telling my story. I was kind of waking up about the seriousness of stuff that had happened and remembering little incidents, and I'd hear other people sharing about it, and I was discovering, wow, I'm not alone. But I think it was at about 6 months, it was like, okay, you know, I really need to feel better now. Now, I had the good fortune back then to be shown 2 techniques that I call the daily practice. If you've watched any of my videos, I talk about them all the time. They help me so much, and that's why I'm always offering them to you. It's a free course. You can get that in the link just below this video in the description section. Daily practice, free course. Takes less than an hour to learn, but it's a writing and a meditation technique. And it saved my life. I learned another way to get my feelings, my negative feelings, like out of here, out of my heart, out of my mind, and onto paper. It very quickly became something that worked about 10 times better for me than the therapy I was doing. And eventually I quit therapy and I continued with this practice of writing. I needed something that I could do all the time. And so one of the benefits of the daily practice done all the time in my early recovery was that it helped me disidentify. Instead of coming in and just being like, oh my gosh, you know, this happened. You know, the year that I got the daily practice, my mother died, my brother died, a person I loved more than anybody in the world ended the relationship with me. I was going through an extremely hard time and I needed somewhere for those feelings to go. Talking about it was making me feel worse. Dwelling on it was making me feel worse. Denying it wasn't even an option. It was so much for me to deal with. I was overwhelmed emotionally. And so then I had a technique where I could get it onto paper. And this is what I've taught now, I don't know, 30, 40,000 of people here through YouTube who have signed up for my free course. Teach it, and I just get letters all day long that it's helped other people too. I don't know if it'll help you, but the one way that you can find out is to try it. It's very, very simple, very compatible with anything else you're doing. But it helps you to go, I have fear, I have resentment. You get it on paper, and you stop identifying with that. It's not that you're denying your feelings, but you're not identifying with them anymore, and you're not identifying with what happened to you. And when you have less fear and resentment about what happened to you, you know what comes in? More and more awareness of who you are now. Who you are now is the person who can actually like have fun, who can have relationships, who can earn money. Like you want to be you now. That's who you want to be, is you now. And it just needs to be less painful to come into present time and get out of the memories and the fantasies of the future. You know, and fantasies can be negative too. You can be very afraid of the future. That's a fantasy. So getting caught up in, oh, the past was terrible, the future's dreadful. You can't be the person who has fun and is alive and makes money and moves around and eats peaches. I'm talking about peaches because today the ripe peaches came out and I'm just like, yay, my life just got like one notch better. I love peaches. Here now is where you want to be. You don't want to be identified with your trauma. You are not your trauma. Number 2, don't give away your power to heal, okay? You're thinking, I don't give away my power to heal, but here's what I mean by that. I get letters all day long from people who are angry that people who hurt them haven't apologized. Therapists they've seen have not figured out how to make them heal. Doctors they went to didn't understand trauma. Now, I am so sorry that this is a world where it's so hard to get understood as a person with CPTSD. And for right now, that is just a fact. You know, you go to the doctor, chances are small. Even if they say they know what it is, they probably don't. At least they're beginning to do like these little tiny trainings for people. But what they teach them may not include stuff that's relevant to you. For example, dysregulation. Like so few clinical professionals know really what dysregulation is. Not just emotional dysregulation, but nervous system dysregulation that is really like the root cause of almost every symptom. When they notice that we say, oh yeah, no, I'll definitely quit smoking. I know it's bad for me, and then we fail to do it. See, they think we don't care. But actually, we're too dysregulated. And stuff like cigarettes and a lot of addictions actually are ways that we can temporarily hold on to a little bit of regulation, even though in the end it sabotages dysregulation. I know that's why I smoke 2 packs a day. By the way, I have this sheet that you can download and give your doctor, and it says, it's called 12 Things I Wish My Doctor Understood About CPTSD. I'm going to throw that link down in the description section too, so you have that. I think a lot of people have found that helpful. And you know what's really exciting? More than 1,000 doctors have downloaded it. I'm very psyched about that. You just have to have patience with the world right now. You're the one who's forging ahead like a pioneer to learn about what this thing is. And once you hear the symptoms and you go, that is what I have, you're the pioneer. You're going to have to turn around and educate people around you, and half of them are not going to want to know. A lot of clinicians are going to feel challenged or threatened because you think you know what's wrong with you. I wouldn't even bother. Like, if you can possibly get to the really cool doctors and therapists who are like, yeah, I want to know what it is. Yeah, you read something helpful. Tell me what it is. I would like to know more. That's a good doctor, by the way. People who want to know more, who don't consider themselves to already know everything there is to know. And especially when it comes to CPTSD, those of us who have it have a unique perspective, and we need to be at the table when people are trying to figure out like what to do about CPTSD. So I've just found a lot of like formal programs out there. They do many things well, but it tends to be more the things that are obvious or that you can see from the outside. And they don't understand the sort of inner workings. And the key thing that I often don't see is the dysregulation of just understanding how when a person with CPTSD gets dysregulated, like triggered and upset, the reasoning goes down. There's this temporary inability to really think straight and a temporary intense emotional feeling. It comes back and we can train ourselves to kind of keep it in balance. So that's what we're doing here. So when I say don't give away your power to heal, I mean don't waste all your energy on being mad at the world for not understanding you because you've just given them your power. Like, come on, world, heal me. Come on, doctor, why haven't you healed me? Come on, well, this therapist, they didn't get me at all. Well, they can't, all right? That information about what we have is only beginning to be published. Everyone with CPTSD who heals from CPTSD is going to have an opportunity to communicate effectively and change this consciousness. You know, in 10, 20 years, this could be a very different thing. And maybe then I can retire. But until then, I'm teaching and teaching and teaching. Like, this is what it feels like to have it. This is what is known about it. And I'm not the end-all be-all of what's known about it. I try to keep up with things. But mostly I'm a person who has it, who's learned how to treat it in myself. I treat myself as sovereign. Sovereign means the queen or king, in your case, perhaps. I am the sovereign of my own healing. And I hire help from consultants such as doctors, therapists. I don't do therapy anymore, but I would if I thought it was a good idea in any particular thing. I hire their professional help to help me with a project of healing that I'm in charge with. This is my ship. I'm the captain. And if something's not working for me, I stop. And if I'm curious about something, I try it. I ask questions. But I take charge of that. And the reason I've had a lot of success finding what works for me is because I tried 1,000 things. I tried and tried and tried. I tried many things that weren't helpful to me. I tried a lot of things that are very helpful to other people, but not for me. I used to just feel terrible, like, what's wrong with me? It's like, nothing's wrong with me. We're each a little different. The way we manifest our CPTSD is a little different. This is not a perfectly measured science yet. We learn what works for us by trying, and we, learn to do that in a boundaried way. And so stick around this channel to keep learning. Like, how do you do that? How do you keep learning how you can identify your triggers, how you can calm them down? And you will be amazed at how much power you actually have to make your life change because you develop the ability to calm your triggers. Your triggers are what empower every bad thing about CPTSD. They make you get dysregulated. They make you get disconnected. They make you act out with self-defeating behaviors. Triggers are the problem. So if you can start to notice, whoops, here I go, I'm getting triggered. Stop. I'm not going to say stuff. I'm going to refrain from trying to solve a problem when I'm triggered and dysregulated. I'm going to get myself re-regulated, and then I'm going to proceed. I kid you not, you can change the course of your life by using tools to catch yourself when you're triggered, get re-regulated, and then proceed. And everyone will be grateful to you for that change in you. They might pressure you in the moment like, oh, this is such a nuisance having you have to get re-regulated. Yeah, well, don't listen. They really, they'll realize soon enough that they didn't really like the dysregulated you. But you're going to have so much more success in anything you try to do, whether it's to keep healing yourself, to be creative, to make money, to have a family, like all the things that you might be desiring in your heart to do start to become accessible to you when you have mastery over your dysregulation. That comes from you being sovereign, all right? It's very unlikely somebody's going to just like plop that in your lap. You can heal whether or not your insurance covers treatment. You can heal whether or not you have help, professional help. You can heal whether or not the professional help you have is with people who understand it. You can heal. You can do this. So that's number 2. Keep your power. You own this. This is your healing. The third mistake that people make about CPTSD, not to make, don't keep talking and talking and talking about the past. Now, isn't that funny? Because for basically the last 100 years, people who had emotional or psychological problems were told, you need to talk about it. Do you have someone to talk to? Why don't you talk to somebody good about that? That is just common sense advice. We were all raised on it. So what happens if, like me, you ended up finding that when you do go talk to somebody about it, you don't get better? And in fact, you start to feel really upset and stressed when you try to talk about it. Well, now we know. That is not true for everybody, but with CPTSD, it's fairly common. And it's dysregulation. Once again, it's dysregulation triggered by talking about trauma. And that's how trauma works. When trauma is lingering in your nervous system, yes, it can be triggered and set off. It can be set off by seeing something, smelling something, right? Hearing something. And it can be set off by talking about it, revisiting the memory. And it turns out that talking about a memory uses a certain pathway in the brain, and somewhere on that pathway is that little trigger. But it's possible for you to communicate what happened to you, to visit it, communicate it, share it with another person. You can do that without talking about it by writing about it and then reading what you wrote. All right? James Pennebaker at University of Texas, Austin, has done decades of research on this. He was doing it not necessarily about trauma, but about the therapeutic value of writing. And it's surprisingly powerful when people are writing about thoughts that bother them. Well, here at Crappy Childhood Fairyland, we use a specific writing technique called the daily practice. And it's specific. And the specific technique involves writing fearful and resentful thoughts, asking for them to be removed, and then following it with meditation. And I just want to say, this is very different. It's very different than talking, all right? It's very different than journaling. Journaling is about recording those thoughts. The techniques we use are about discarding those thoughts. They're about getting them on paper so you can stop thinking them, get rid of them, trusting that anything that you actually need to remember or do or respond to that's visiting your fears today is going to come back to you. Your mind is merely going to get clearer, not blank, not empty, just clearer, so that a lot of the free-floating anxiety and things you don't actually need to worry about, they evaporate. Some things you do need to worry about, like, wow, I forgot to make my follow-up appointment at the dentist. I've got to do that. Or things that are even more crucial. So when you have a clear mind that's not all cluttered up with fear and resentment, you can remember better, you can prioritize better, you can even make a conscious decision about how you will use your mind in a given moment. Like, that's really weird. The first time that happened to me, I didn't even recognize it. But basically, when you're dysregulated and CPTSD has hold of your thinking, you're never really in charge of what you're thinking about. You know, you're trying to use it. Somebody says, here, you know, fill out this worksheet. And you go, okay, and you start doing it. But very quickly, your mind is wandering. Or you're sitting in a group of people and people are having a discussion and you're listening to them, but very quickly your mind is wandering. And usually it's going inside to fearful, resentful thoughts. What does she mean by that? Hey, these guys are friends. I think these people all have plans for lunch and they didn't invite me. So these little hamsters on the hamster wheel are just going, going, going. And you can barely or partially only pay attention to what's going on around you. And that's going to limit your happiness. It's going to limit your effectiveness and participation in life. Instead of talking about that trouble, you take it to the paper. Now, I love these techniques because they involve a pen and a paper, and in so many settings, there is nothing weird about sitting there writing on a pad of paper. You can do it in the theater, you can do it in the office, you can do it on a train. Nobody bats an eye. You're not just standing on your head or doing some funny eye-catching technique. You're just doing something that nobody notices. But privately, what you're doing is you're releasing a bunch of fearful and resentful thoughts that are cluttering your perception so that you can think clearly, you can have lucidity, you can have calmness. Those are the fruits of when you stop talking about your trauma. Now, I don't want to knock it. It is necessary to talk sometimes about your trauma. It's so important to tell your story in whatever form you decide to tell it. Almost everybody's healing begins with acknowledging what happened and telling at least one other person, this is what happened to me. Some people write a book. Some people join a group. Some people go tell a therapist. Some people finally tell a spouse. It's all good that we do it sometimes, but it's just that when it goes on and on and on, it can be fruitless. It's not the way that all of your healing is going to come. And I think that in a lot of cases, for the last however many decades, therapy has been set up on the assumption that if you could just keep talking about it, you would eventually have a breakthrough. And I assume a lot of people have had that breakthrough, or else there wouldn't even be therapy. I mean, it's so prevalent. It's still so, it's like what insurance pays for when you need help. So there must be something to it. But for me, going and talking about my trauma doesn't help me process anything. It like sort of freezes up my ability to process information. I remember, you know, the therapist would write down some goals we wrote down that this week I'm going to something. See, I can't even remember because when I'm dysregulated, I can't form memories. I really can't use any good thing that happened in there. And mostly I would just go in there and cry, and the distress would accelerate and amplify. The more I talked about it, the more upset I got. And good therapists tried to figure that out and make the most of it and help me. And eventually I would always just quit. You know, I'd give it a try, 2 years here, 4 years there, 11 different therapists, but it was just the same every time. Finally, I learned. First I learned this technique to write my fears and resentments, and it worked. And then I learned the science about why that might be. that writing about trauma and reading what you wrote to a buddy or somebody who also does this, that's something you'll learn in my course, in my free course. If you can read it to somebody, you can get relief in any time. You don't have to wait for a weekly appointment. You have relief at your fingertips. You can have this pad of paper in your purse all the time, pen and paper, just with you all the time. Folded up paper in your back pocket. You always have it. You can have it by the bed. You can have it in the car. Pull over and discharge those triggered feelings that are coming out. And that is how you can calm your triggers. So that's why I say don't keep talking about trauma, about bad memories from the past. You can use a mix of methods, part talking, but also part writing, maybe some somatic body type things. A lot of people use exercises, yoga, dance, martial arts. There are many ways to relieve your dysregulation. You can learn about those on my website at crappychildhoodfairy.com. Number 4, don't use isolation to control your triggers. A lot of us end up doing that. If it's not like complete isolation where we go off and be a hermit, we find a way to keep everybody at arm's length. Don't do that. You need other people to heal, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because if you have CPTSD, one of the most difficult things is needing people. Dealing with people and all the dynamics there can be so triggering and so expensive for us. It can cost days of dysregulation just to have a little friction with somebody. And so it's like a prison. If you end up using isolation to keep that dysregulation at bay, yes, it's a temporary fix, but so many of us have ended up isolating through years. And you know what happens when you isolate all the time? You get a little bit weird, okay? Take it from someone who knows. It's really important to stay connected to people, even though it's hard. And how you can do that is take it a little at a time. A little at a time. You don't have to throw yourself in and join this deep club that meets every day. You can do a little at a time and use short things. If connecting with people is something you need to develop a little bit, I do have a course for that, the Connection Bootcamp. So I keep plugging courses, but they're all down. I'll put all the links down there so you can find some support for that there. But you don't want to stay isolated as a way to control your triggers. What you want to do is learn to control your triggers whether you're around people or not. That's your freedom. If you know that you can control your triggers, you're going to find very quickly that you have true social mobility. You can go to a party if you want because you know if it starts to just get totally awful for you, you know what to do. You have tools to deal with it and stay, or you can leave. You don't have to get so completely jammed up and paralyzed with fear about how am I going to deal with it? I better not go. So those days are over for you now. You have freedom because you have tools, all right? Number 5, don't try to make other people control your triggers for you. All right? Don't give them that power. What you want to do instead is you control your triggers and then you have freedom to hang out with anybody you like. It's so tempting because it feels like when you are triggered and when you have PTSD, it seems so much that other people are causing the trigger. So let's say you go on a couple dates with somebody and they say they're going to call and they don't call and you go into a great big abandonment depression over it. Then when they do call a day later than they said they would call, you're raging at them. Well, and then they don't want to go out with you. What just happened there is you're making somebody else responsible for your trigger. That rage feeling or that panic or that abandonment depression that came from somebody not calling when they said they would, I totally know what it's like. It's very intense and severe. But it's CPTSD. It's not actually caused by the other person. So you could, if they would continue to see you after that behavior, which they probably might not, but if they were, it would also be tempting to say, don't ever not call when you said you were going to call. We've dated 2 times and by now you owe me this commitment to call when you say you're going to call. Well, it doesn't work. It's an attempt to control other people. But worst of all, it's outsourcing the responsibility to not get triggered. And no matter how much other people try not to trigger you, it ain't going to work. It's not going to happen. They can't really control whether we get triggered because if it's not calling you when they said they were going to call, it's going to be something else. If you're just sitting there like a ticking time bomb of triggers, sooner or later it's going to go off. And you know what? Good, loving, healthy people, they don't want to get in trouble just for, being who they are. Nobody wants to be criticized for being who they are. So your job in dating is A, to work on your triggers and keep them calm, and then B, pay attention to the way people treat you. If somebody not calling when they say they will is a bummer for you, then maybe you don't want to go out with that person. I wouldn't go and tear them a new one over it because you just met them. You're always going to get better results when the triggered part is something that you own and you take responsibility for. And the connecting with other people part is where you're not giving them responsibility to keep you untriggered. You can ask them to meet you halfway on things that you want in the relationship. You absolutely can. You get to have boundaries, but you don't give away the power to trigger you or not trigger you. Yes, there are a few exceptions. Let's say somebody has a spider phobia. Could they not just put tarantulas in your face? Okay, I think that's a reasonable way of saying, could you not trigger me? I have one. I have like a deal breaker thing. I say, you cannot tickle me. I was tickle tortured as a kid, like to an extreme degree, and I can't stand being tickled. And I kid you not, if somebody tries to tickle me, and it's been a long time, but if they do, I can almost not control my impulse to like punch, kick, to fight it like the worst thing. If anybody's close to me, they know darn well, do not tickle me, not cool. You get to have exceptions to that. The vicious circle of childhood trauma works like this. Bad things happened to you when you were a kid and caused X amount of damage to your emotions, your health, your ability to perceive who is a safe person, to your confidence, to get away from people who don't have your best interest at heart. And then those wounds turn into new traumas in your life in the form of self-defeating behaviors. And these are patterns every traumatized person develops unless they get interrupted or healed, and they can go on and on and on. And in my life, I'd say 20% of the trauma that I've carried was stuff that happened to me as a kid. And 80% of my trauma is the result of trauma-driven decisions and patterns in my behavior. So there's trauma from the outside of myself and trauma from the inside of myself. And when they're happening, it feels like I have no control over them at all. Do you have this? You definitely don't have control over what was done to you in the past, but as much as it feels like a mystery, like the same bad things keep happening in your adult life for no reason at all, it seems like, you can trace adult traumas oftentimes to decisions you made or boundaries you weren't able to set. And so even though those glitches are probably trauma-driven, there actually is hope that you can notice where you're slipping into self-defeating behaviors and begin to change. Nobody talks about this enough. When we talk about trauma, we talk about what was done to us. But the part we keep doing to ourselves is just as important because this is what we have the power to change. Very little healing is possible until the self-defeating behaviors have been stopped, or at least the major ones. And if they're not, they can absolutely ruin your life. Thankfully, there are ways to stop re-traumatizing yourself like this, to heal from the past and start living your present-day life in a way that's positive, self-loving, constructive, and just not traumatic. And it's a life where you're happy and where you're safe and you're loved. So in my courses and coaching programs, I teach people how to heal from the effects of childhood PTSD, how to make changes step by step, from brain healing to emotional healing, to healing the ability to connect with other people. And then on the way to the really advanced levels is this: identifying and changing your self-defeating behaviors. Now, this is the hardest thing to face. People who aren't ready to heal aren't ready to do this, to acknowledge that today a lot of what's hurting you and holding you back, it's not your parents, not anymore, but it's your own behavior. I know, right? I learned this the hard way, believe me. It's not your fault that you were hurt like this, but now every bit of your courage is going to be needed because there are things that only you can change. Self-defeating behaviors are those things. Are you able to let this in? The horrible irony of surviving abuse and neglect in childhood is that the more you were hurt back then, the more likely you are to adopt these self-defeating behaviors that make the effects of the original trauma even worse. These are things like the people you allow into your life, the way you take care of yourself, the choices you make about partners and jobs and money and where you live, the people you admire, the things you say, and of course, the way you act. It's easy to spot this tendency in other people, but sometimes it's really hard to see it in ourselves. We go into denial, we defend what we're doing as necessary so that we can feel okay, but it doesn't actually make things better. You can turn around self-defeating behaviors into a positive progression, and you can make the trauma stop. Okay, so let's look at these traumas. Number one is neglect of your body, and this includes having clothes that are not appropriate or really shabby? Like, look in your drawers. What's going on in there? Do you have poor hygiene? Do you floss? Do you neglect physical exercise? Are you staying current on medical and dental care? Do you self-harm? Okay. Number 2 is blame. And blame could be like difficulty seeing your own role in problems. It could be victim thinking, bitterness, slandering others, like talking about them all the time to others, having the belief that all the problems that you have are the result of the country you're in, or racism, or sexism, or foreigners, or a political party, or religion, or lack of religion, or certain foods, your parents. Just, you know, the belief that all your problems are from this like outside thing. That is not actually realistic. Number 3, self-defeating behavior is black and white thinking. It's really common for people with CPTSD. And what you see is that people like us are really drawn to extreme views. We're drawn to extreme groups and authority figures and even cults. We're into belief systems. And we are more likely than other people to get outraged at the news. Like there's something about that is very emotionally dysregulating and whoosh, you know. We lose our freedom to disagree because we can't step back from conflict, and we are drawn either to being dominated or to dominating other people, cutting them off, going no contact with friends rather than talking things out. Okay. Number 4 is numbing with substances. We are prone to try to relieve stress with alcohol and drugs, or taking more medication than we should, or one that's actually not prescribed to us. That's kind of a trauma-driven behavior and a self-defeating behavior. And I will talk about food and media in terms of addictions too. Addictive use of food, carb binging, unhealthy weight, eating disorders, obsession with eating correctly, which is called orthorexia, by the way. And then another one, addictive use of media. Do you play video games? Do you watch TV all the time? Are you always on the internet? Is it bad enough that it's interfering with your sleep or your meals or your daily routine or your responsibilities at work or with your family? That's an addiction. Okay. Another one, dishonesty. And this includes not just lies, but like exaggerating, hiding important personal truths or preferences about yourself, stealing, being unfaithful, and even things that some people consider ordinary, like tax evasion or illegal activity. All right, another self-defeating behavior, work problems. And this includes like chronic adversarial relationships with your boss, with your coworkers, doing unfulfilling work, under-earning. That's a huge problem for people with CPTSD. Neglect of the learning that you need and the skill development that you need to, you know, continue in your job, suing people, getting sued, that kind of thing. All right, another self-defeating behavior, irritability. And I use this very generally, and that means like having frequent arguments with people, falling out with friends and neighbors and partners, not having good relationships with your family because of you, ranting, rage, mistreating other people, seeking revenge on people, getting violent, right? Or I want to add this, being hostile on social media, including YouTube. All right. Attraction to troubled partners and friends. I think this is one of the hugest self-defeating behaviors, and this is the one that really pushes it into the next generation. This is a very powerful self-defeating behavior. It's an important one to prioritize if this is a problem for you, and this would be if you're repeatedly drawn into relationships that turn out to be abusive, controlling, damaging to other relationships, damaging to your family, damaging to your finances. If you're claiming other people are abusive or narcissistic, but staying in those relationships, you're doing that self-defeating behavior, all right? Rationalizing why staying is necessary is one of the signs. Having an unfulfilling romantic life or no dating relationship or staying in bad relationships is another self-defeating behavior. Maybe you're creating or staying in sexless or loveless partnerships, okay? Here's another one, abuse of your sexuality. Having an overly sexualized appearance, overly sexualized conduct, losing your dignity around sex, losing your emotional security or the ability to be real around sex and relationship dynamics, doing things that you don't want to do or that make you feel ashamed, unwanted pregnancy or compulsive behavior around sex. And this would include things like the use of porn. Another self-defeating behavior is fantasy, and this would include romantic and financial. And that is a flight from reality when things are tough, not really being here, not in touch with reality, and failing to take responsibility and responsible action, and having huge unrealistic expectations and promises, and inflating the importance of relationships or events or the future or personal attributes or your prospects. So it's all fantasy. All this energy is going into this picture, but not really into the real life steps involved in getting there. At the far end of this self-defeating behavior is like obsession and stalking. And even before it gets that far, you'll start to see signs that you neglect your health, you neglect your work, you neglect your family, you're starting to avoid people. All right. Avoiding people is a self-defeating behavior in its own right. And this is like avoiding responsibility, avoiding participation, isolating, being a social anorectic, if you know that word, social, sexual, emotional anorexia. You can sometimes do this even when you're in a couple, like couples will become socially anorectic, or groups will. They just don't deal with anything else. Okay. Here's another one. Debting. Debting is when you live beyond your means to pay for your home, your car, your therapy, whatever it is. The growth of debt, gambling, foreclosure, bankruptcy, homelessness, having a vague sense of the path towards becoming solvent. That's what it looks like. Now, I allow that, of course, financial difficulties could happen to anybody, but when I'm talking about the self-defeating behavior, it's like continuing to make the choices that push you there when there really is an alternative, which is basically spending more than you have. Another self-defeating behavior is repeating traumatic patterns, seemingly being unable to detect trouble ahead or to step back when trouble appears, just like marching right into it. You relapse into a traumatized state, triggering or deepening the depression, the rage, the feeling of collapse that's been going on with you in the past with your traumas, and then you fall back into old behaviors. And that's another one. I know how hard it is to stay out of that. It can feel like it's just happening to you. When you can't heal from the past, though, your life stays small. So are you ready to stop living small, to start living in the big way that you intend, that you want? Kids who grew up with a lot of conflict in the house often grow up and land in high conflict relationships. If you got used to shouting and animosity between your parents or even violence, it may feel normal to you to be in relationships where you get shouted at or where you actively dislike your partner. Every couple has disagreements, and conflict is, it's natural and healthy. It's part of relationships. But how do you know when a healthy level of arguing has gone too far? My letter today is from someone I'll call Belinda, and she writes, "Hi Anna, I've recently discovered your YouTube channel and wanted to write in for your advice. I'm grappling with whether or not to end my relationship. I'm 38 and have a good but not very close relationship with my parents, who divorced when I was about 5. I've never had a diagnosis of CPTSD. And I'm fortunate to have never experienced anything like some of the terrible circumstances, abuse, and neglect that some of your viewers write about. I feel very selfish for saying this, and I'm sure my parents would be shocked and horrified to hear that I relate to so much of what you describe about emotional dysregulation and struggles with interpersonal relationships." Well, don't worry, Belinda. You are in the right place. And I'm circling here a couple things you're saying so I can come back to them. I'll read your letter all the way through, and then we'll come back and I can help you with what you tell me. Okay. So I do believe I grew up in a loving household, but from the youngest age I felt very sad and quite alone. I was timid and afraid of going to school, going on trips, to kids' parties, etc. I think I had quite an anxious attachment bond with my mother. We spent every second weekend with my dad, and there were many tears about that, as I rarely wanted to go. I'm sure the tears and tantrums put a lot of pressure on my mother, who had to work full time. I just remember being very checked out as a kid, and I remember my mom shouting at us a lot. The only memory I have of my dad being at the house was when my mother called him one morning that I was crying and didn't want to go to school, and he came over and beat me so much my mother was afraid to send me to school that day, in case teachers noticed the red marks on my skin. I think I'd have been around 7 years old at that time. As I got older, Weekends with my dad frequently devolved into tears and my mom having to come and get me. When I was around 12, I learned that my dad had had an affair and that I had a half-brother. I was 18 before I finally shared this information with my mother. I naively thought she didn't know, but of course she did. His affair was the reason for their divorce. My mother also had some health problems when I was younger, breast cancer, for which she had radiotherapy, and later, cancer of the neck, which was also treated successfully. My grandparents used to help care for us a lot while my mother had treatment. Nobody really spoke about it. My mother just sort of quietly went through it, and that's just how my family dealt with things. Just get on with it. Looking back, I think my mother must have been miserable and struggling with illness, 2 kids, a house, and a job. As you can tell, this isn't a story of terrible abuse or neglect. I almost feel embarrassed writing to you, but so much of what you talk about in your videos has resonated with me. In my teens and early 20s, I used to sleep around a lot. I didn't have a proper boyfriend until I was 20, and the first time we broke up, I had a major meltdown and almost took my own life. Okay, the next serious boyfriend I had after that, I married. He was 10 years older than me and a kind, steady, reliable sort of person. With hindsight, these were definitely the sort of qualities I need in a partner, but it didn't work out as intellectually we weren't a good match and had few things in common. After my divorce, then in my early 30s, I met someone who was head over heels in love with me, but he almost certainly had CPTSD from living with an abusive alcoholic father. The early part of our relationship was very difficult and took a huge emotional toll on me. He was very possessive, controlling, and emotional, and I had to walk on eggshells to keep the peace. I felt like I compromised myself in that relationship and let him trespass on my boundaries, such as my privacy on more than one occasion. The pain I felt at the end of that relationship was similar to death. It took me 2 years to build myself back from it. I have now been in a relationship that just started casually, just sex, before we realized we in fact have quite a lot in common. He had just come out of a serious relationship when we met, so he wasn't looking for anything serious. He was very domineering and opinionated, whereas I'm more passive. He's black and white thinking, whereas I'm open-minded. We have many shared interests, and he impresses me with his honest, straightforward approach and lack of fear. He's very mature and emotionally aware of himself, and he has supported me enormously. Since we've been together about 8 months now, I've been in the final year of a degree which I found very stressful and have been struggling with my anxiety and depression without medication, which I stopped taking shortly before we met. He has many qualities which I admire, and there is much good stuff here. But here's the rub. His certitude and domineering personality leaves me feeling utterly steamrolled at times. Arguments frequently erupt because he's so quick to offer his opinion and advice before listening to me. If I don't agree with his opinion or follow his advice, he takes it as rejection. He works on a building site, and I can only describe him as an alpha male, and his tone and way of speaking is quite rough generally. He's blunt sometimes to the point that I find unnecessary and hurtful, but on the other hand, I do value his honest approach. The trouble is that when I take a similar tone with him, he doesn't take it well, and very quick to point out, whereas I would generally let it slide. This has caused many arguments which, due to my emotional dysregulation, leave me utterly wiped out. I end up stuck in bed, unable to engage with life at all, and my studies have suffered as a result. I know that these emotional reactions are disproportionate, but at the same time, I'm wondering whether he is the right partner for me because I get so triggered. I've tried to tell him how he invalidates my feelings by saying it's just me being sensitive, and at the same time doesn't realize how sensitive he is too. I guess I'm wondering if it's a red flag that we argue so much about how we're arguing and not about anything major. I just need the communication to feel different for me to feel secure. He has a very strong voice in our relationship, and I'm worried if I can't make myself heard and understood, then he's the type that could easily walk all over me. Should I be worried that our styles are so different? We've been able to resolve arguments well and have both done our share of apologizing, but they have become so frequent that there is less and less will on either side to try to communicate more effectively. I'd like to find a better way before all these arguments take such a huge emotional toll on me. Your advice would be much appreciated. Belinda. Thank you, Belinda. I think I can help. I do have experience with this. And this is a tricky one. I don't have a perfect answer for you here. I think it's going to take some time of discernment here. But I circled things you said. Let me come back and just repeat some of the things you told me. You never had a diagnosis of CPTSD. Most people haven't. It's a self-identification based on symptoms. So some of the things you mentioned where you kept saying you're embarrassed and ashamed that you shouldn't have problems. So that's interesting. You have this stoicism where you believe that you have an obligation to not be as hurt or wounded as other people, and you're comparing what happened to you to what happened to other people. But one thing we know for sure is that different people are different. The same circumstances can cause people to turn out quite differently, and look at siblings in the same family, right? So it's okay, you just are how you are. And if you relate to the symptoms, the thing about here at Crappy Childhood Fairy, I don't really focus that much on what happened to people. Like, people give me the background and we have a little information. It's like, this is what I come from. But when people send me letters, I'm always like, keep it kind of short with the background. Just give me a couple reference points. I want to hear about the problem today. That's what I can help you with, because what happened in the past, it's done. Other people did it. So we can't go back in time, and we can't change how other people are, even if they're still alive. Even if they want to change, it's like the wound happened. So now what I teach people to do, regardless of anything they do about healing the past, is to heal the way it's affecting them now. So what happened to you, you have a strong feeling it affected you now, and that makes sense to me. Something happened to you. Perhaps you were a very sensitive kid, but there was a lot of crying around your kid's divorce. I don't know if you know this, but just parents splitting up is a trauma. Also, your mom having breast cancer is a huge trauma, and going to the hospital, people not talking about it, having to go live with your grandparents. I'm glad they cared for you. Yes, yes, grateful, blah, blah. But oh my gosh, your mom had breast cancer. How terrifying. How scared everybody must have been around you. And even if you were a kid and you didn't understand what everything meant or what the prognosis really was, the fear everybody felt would have been very destabilizing to a kid. So you know what? You get to identify with the symptoms, and you get to go on the assumption that, yeah, your childhood had enough uncertainty and pain and worry in it that you struggle with these things. So that's okay. You're fine. You're in the right place. All right. So you had to go see your dad. You used to cry. Then you found out he had an affair. And I've been talking about this lately. A lot of people who write to me, there was an affair. There was infidelity with the parents. And I don't think that gets talked about enough, that whether the marriage survives or not, it usually doesn't, there's a real hurt to the kids about that. There's something primal that is disrupted by that betrayal and dishonesty between the parents. Kids are imprinting on that. And I would just speculate, this is something that happened with my parents too, I would just speculate that there is something very important that we're threading together about how we trust people, what a relationship looks like, what the trust and openness and realness between two people is. Affairs are, they are hidden by nature. They're hidden. It's all lies. Little kids are not, they can't always understand the information and the words, but they sure feel the vibe. They can smell it on people, the lie. And so when grown-ups are saying one thing, but you can feel with your senses, like no, this isn't true, something's not safe. Or go to your dad's, no, I don't want to, I feel terrible there. When people aren't letting you acknowledge and support you in responding to your feelings like that, you learn to shut them down. So that's a wound that was done to you, and now here you are, you're going to start healing that wound, and you're going to begin to know your feelings and express yourself and stand up for yourself, even if you're clumsy at it at first, all right? Because we all are, at first, clumsy at it. It comes out, it's like a teenage period when we start to go, I have a boundary, stop, don't do that, don't talk to me like that. Sometimes we find out it's like, oh, that boundary, it's kind of like I was overstepping. So sometimes that happens, but that's okay. We must go through this phase of development where we learn who we are, what we deserve, and we learn to defend it and fight for it if we have to. And so it's my opinion, and this only is true for me now that I use my daily practice techniques twice a day. If I'm using my daily practice techniques twice a day, which helps me to get honest with myself, I read to my mentor sometimes and get feedback. And over 28 years of doing this, you don't have to be 28 years before it benefits you. I think it could help right away. But after many years of doing this, I have more trust of myself that I can express what I really think. I also have developed a lot more consideration for other people in these years. So what's given me confidence to say how I feel and fight for myself and stand up and say, hey, not cool. No, you don't get to say that. You know, I do that. My mother's from Brooklyn, right? I'm married to a guy who's from Northern England. We have very culturally different ideas about how to have a disagreement. I'll just be like, hey, da, 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 you know. My grandparents were immigrants. They were from Norway, actually, which is not a super expressive country, but they lived amongst all these people from Italy and, you know, people who did express themselves. And that's how my mom came up. Her language was peppered with all these Yiddish words and Italian words and foods. And so, you know, I come from this like melting pot environment that my mom grew up in, where there is self-expression. And for people who didn't have that, who had something more reserved, it feels like too much. So I'm not invalidating that his intensity is too much. Like, I'd have to see it, right? I think it's hard to judge somebody else through the eyes of their partner, strictly speaking. And you're not describing your abuse. You're just saying he's kind of an opinion bully. And he has his opinion and it's so strong. But when one person hasn't been free to express themselves and the other person is good at expressing themselves and you have that dynamic, the one who expresses themselves will feel like they're bullying, but that's not necessarily what it is. They are just expressing themselves. If you didn't grow up that way, you're probably never going to be super like, hey, this is how I feel, I'm emoting, you know, I'm telling you my opinion. You might never be like that, but it's possible you could get more comfortable with it. And the question is, because you're just like, where it is right now, it's grinding you down. That's not acceptable. That's not a bad sign. You said, I don't want it to make me feel this way. That's a good impulse. You don't want it to make you feel the way that you're feeling. So either he has to change, or you have to learn to be more accepting of who he is, or, this is the most likely positive outcome if you can find it, is you meet in the middle. That he tries to be more mindful that his intensity and the opinions and, you know, hitting you with them, and when he notices like you're not saying anything or you start to look like a deer in the headlights, if he could become more aware and pull back from that. And a partner who loves you can work with you a little bit on that. But it's not really realistic that somebody can stop being who they are. And self-expression is one of the fruits of healing, that you can say what you really think. Even higher than self-expression is consideration of others. Now, some people, they never get self-expression, they just consider others. That's codependence. Some people only express themselves and never consider others. That's selfishness, right? So a mix in each person and listening to each other and meeting in the middle. It's okay that you guys have different styles. If you find that no matter what he does, you still, you know, your life is just crumbling apart, that is a red flag. That sounds like you might not be compatible. But you say you like his forthrightness. After all that deception in your family, I imagine that's refreshing. So I see possibility here if you can find it. I would encourage you, if you wish, to check out the techniques I teach for calming triggers. Because sometimes if people are acting a certain way that's triggering, you can ask them to stop or be considerate. That might get you some success. You can just decide to like put up with it. That might get you some success. The most powerful thing that I've ever done about getting triggered about things is I use these techniques, the fear and resentment writing. It's a special technique. Don't try this at home. Take the course. It's very specific. Followed by meditation, where you can just start kind of like unwinding something that wound you up. You unwind it. You get lucid again. You're not forgiving anything bad that happens. You're not losing your boundaries. You're not just going, oh, I accept everything. You're just getting a bunch of the sort of like the intense trauma-driven reaction just kind of like out of the way, so you can go, wait, how do I really feel about this? And you may find, like I did, it's very, very, very helpful. And it's free. It's something that you can do anytime. The course is free. It's called The Daily Practice. It's on the free tools page of my website. There's also a link to it sort of in the middle of the description section under my videos. But try that and see if you can, if your triggers are maybe adjustable at all. They may not. I'm not saying I'm not trying to gaslight you into saying it's your fault or anything, but if you love this guy, I think it's worth a try to start working on those trigger symptoms. And the way you grew up, I would just say, of course you have triggers, of course. I mean, everybody has some, but really after what you went through, they're there. So we're learning to, and also where you say you just sort of like checked out as a kid, checking out is like not expressing yourself. I'm sure it wasn't safe. I mean, who gets to express themselves to their parents? Not very many of us. So, so now's your chance to heal this.
Now, fear and resentment are the two things we're writing about in the daily practice. There's a writing exercise and a meditation exercise. And when we're writing fears and resentments, because those are the two things that can really clutter up your mind and set off dysregulation. So with childhood PTSD, we all get dysregulated sometimes. We all re-regulate. We do it naturally. But when PTSD is active, it can be really hard to re-regulate as quickly as you want, when you want. So this daily practice is a way to start mastering re-regulation. And you begin by writing fears and resentments on paper to help you master and be able to fluidly go from dysregulation to re-regulation. And in fact, I write twice a day whether I'm dysregulated or regulated. It doesn't matter. I do it regularly, and it's kind of a preventive. So if you haven't tried this before, I've put the instructions, there's a link to them, in the description section below. So you can go to that and download it and follow along if you want, or you can just kind of watch the video and try it later. But in this video, I want to talk specifically about resentments. Now, if you've tried this daily practice, you might be someone who finds it pretty easy to identify fears that are just kind of rolling through your mind, but harder to notice when what you're dealing with is resentment. Like if it's not screaming at you, you might not identify it as a resentment. Now, in my experience, fears are all the little thoughts that clutter up your mind. It could be very trivial, it could be very deep, but like when I'm writing in the morning, some typical fears I would have is, fear I'm stupid, fear I have too much to do today, fear no one likes me, fear my cell phone will give me cancer, fear something bad will happen to my kid. And you've heard me talk about these metaphorically, these fears, as wet leaves sticking to a windshield. If you did have like leaves all over a windshield, you would just pull them off. You wouldn't need to like look at them or analyze what tree they came from. They just come off and you throw them away. And that's what we're doing with fears and resentments when we write them down in the daily practice. So when we have less fear, it is like a clear windshield in that we have greater clarity and it's easier for us to just move forward. So the same goes for resentments. Now, often resentments are a cluster of fears, and they look like they're just something you're kind of annoyed about, or maybe you just go, oh, I hate that person, I hate this thing. And in fact, it's so common, like, when we participate in social media, to be exposed to people venting and hating and full of resentment, that it just kind of feels like how people talk. But as you begin to have a daily practice, you'll start to notice that what you have is resentment. And it's important to know this because resentments on your windshield are not like leaves, they're more like rocks and logs. And if they pile up, they'll cause you to crash. Resentment is toxic and resentment is contagious, and you don't actually need it. So what do I mean when I say that a resentment is a cluster of fears? So I'm just going to make up an example, and I'm going to show you how I would write about it in my daily practice on my imaginary piece of paper right here. Now, I realize that a lot of you haven't tried the writing exercise yet, and if you would like to try it while you're watching this video, I have included a link to the instructions in the description section right below this video, but you can just watch the video and try that later if you want. So I'm writing my daily fears and resentments down, and as I'm going along, I notice that I'm resentful at, let's say, my coworker, Claudia. I'm just making this up. I don't even know a Claudia, and I'm self-employed and don't have coworkers, so. But let's just say she interrupted me at an important meeting and I wasn't able to make my point. And I think that made me look foolish. And now, a few days later, I still can't stop thinking about it. So my writing might go something like this. I am resentful at Claudia because I have fear she jumped in when I was presenting my idea to management. And notice how I didn't say I'm resentful because she did that. I write, I'm resentful at Claudia because I have fear she jumped in and did that. I'm going to put everything as a fear, whether I know it happened or not. So fear she jumped in and I couldn't make my point to management. And I couldn't get my idea across. And then I stop and notice. And you know what? There's more fear about that. Fear I should have cut in on her. Fear, and I would have looked aggressive if I had done that. And fear, either way, I was going to look bad. And fear, I'll get laid off in this job for being aggressive or for not speaking up. And fear, even if I lose one paycheck, that I could lose my apartment. And fear, Claudia's friends with all the cool people at the office. And fear, I'm not going to get invited to her birthday party. And fear, I don't get along with women. And fear, my idea was stupid anyway. And fear, no one likes me. And here we go again. And this is just an example to show how there's like many, many fears under this resentment at one person. And it wasn't just the thing that she did. There was a whole bunch of like insecurity and financial worries and fear of not being good enough, all bound up in that one resentment. And you find you get it on paper out like that and release it. It just doesn't have that much power over you, and it doesn't have the power to dysregulate. It was really those deeper fears that were coming up and getting dysregulating, not the thing that happened. And you can see how this relatively tiny event can come to seem so devastating in the PTSD mind and even trigger dysregulation. And that makes it doubly hard to deal with things like interruptions in the moment when they're happening. Have you ever had that where like you want to speak up, but you kind of doubt yourself? You somehow know you're overreacting, and so you fall silent or you back out of the situation? Well, the thing I love about daily writing is that no one has to know you're doing it. At the moment when Claudia interrupted me and I filled up with emotion and fear, I could take out my pen and paper and just start getting it down on the paper. And all anyone in the room knows is that I'm writing, and they assume I'm taking notes. But I'm really doing something better and more productive, and that is I'm clearing my mind and emotions of all the dreck on my windshield that keeps me from being present and contributing to the meeting. And it really works. You have to try this. You write a little bit, and then you write the sign-off that you'll find on the instructions, and your capacity to be calm and to pay attention and, if you like, speak up and contribute, have just been restored to the full level again. So recovering from childhood PTSD really begins with these little mini healings. We get dysregulated, we get re-regulated. And when you have mastery over this process, it's not that you never get resentful or that you never get dysregulated, but you just know what to do. And you don't have to waste a lot of time in that dysregulated state or end up saying things you don't mean. You fall off the horse, you get back on the horse. Now, many people ask, don't I need my resentment to protect me from people taking advantage? And I'd say, you need your awareness to protect you. And part of your awareness might involve anger sometimes. Anger is just a natural emotion. It comes up when someone threatens you or offends you. But resentment, which comes from the word like resent, and sent being like part of sentient or sentimental, it means to feel. So resent is to feel again and again and again and again, over and over, and become consumed with this feeling. If we ever do take action, resentment it makes it come out all wrong. And we all know people who have gone bonkers because they're so overfull with resentment. They go on and they can't see their part in their problems, and they're blaming other people. And, they're boring. They're boring everyone to death, telling story after story after story about this thing that happened. So don't be that person. Don't worry that by releasing your resentment through writing that you'll become a doormat. Anything but. Doormats are people so confused about their feelings that they choose to kind of err on the side of people-pleasing. But you, with less resentment, that's just you with more clarity. And more clarity means more choices about how you want to proceed.
If you took a poll and you had to name your 5 biggest triggers for trauma reactions, like feeling trapped or humiliated or having an angry outburst, one of them, if you're like me, would be bad customer service. It's one thing when it's a restaurant or a retail shop where you have the option of never going there again, but when it's your mobile phone carrier or your gas and electric company or your bank or your health plan, where you're at the mercy of the other person to not cut off your access to these things you need, if they then treat you in a way that's unfair or demeaning or in a way that humiliates you in front of other customers, that can be a huge trigger for complex PTSD symptoms. Have you ever really lost your cool in those situations, either as a customer or as the customer service worker. If one person tips over into emotional dysregulation or says something unkind, it's really common for the other person to get tipped over too. Both people will spend the next several hours in a dysregulated state. And both people's families will likely find them stressed at the end of the day. And you can see how the ripple effect of one bad interaction can go on and on. But also, if one of those people can turn around a bad interaction or prevent it, or have a really positive customer service interaction, that also has a ripple effect on all the lives it touches. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. It's not just how bad customer service triggers CPTSD, but how good customer service can be a path of healing and even of joy. And I'm not exaggerating, a path of healing old traumas and bringing happiness and joy, even when you're just busy buying groceries, or even when you're in jobs that are considered menial. It doesn't always happen, but there are things you can do to tip it in the right direction. You want to talk about this? Now, why do I know about this stuff? A little known fact is 15 or 20 years ago, I used to be a customer service consultant, and I taught people how to transform customer service at the system level and at the level of one-to-one interactions. I loved this work. And before I ever made YouTube videos, and before I even knew the word for CPTSD, I was teaching some of these same principles that I teach on this channel. I was intuitively noticing trauma in people and how it affected them. And I was teaching about staying focused on the positive outcome that you want in an interaction, and about noticing and calming your triggers. And I'd get brought in to lead a half-day workshop, usually with a clinic team or a phone support department. Usually it was a group of workers who had been getting a lot of complaints from customers. So talk about a tough crowd. I'd walk in, and in almost every case, I'd face a group of people who were pissed off. They were feeling blamed, they were feeling tired, and they were just like daring me with their eyes to prove to them that I wasn't just one more useless trainer. And I'll tell you, I think a lot of my students back then were traumatized on the job from being immersed in bad interactions. They were often in systems that generated a lot of frustration and disappointment in customers. And the people working with those customers were bearing the brunt of that customer anger. They were getting blamed, but they didn't feel like they had the power to change anything. And for anyone who's ever had a job with conditions like that, you know it just sucks the life out of you. Your trauma goes up like a lot of the time. And when I'd start my workshop, I'd say most people felt like victims of their customers. And I could see how things got to that point. They weren't crazy, but they did have the power to make a lot of those interactions go differently, even so. And I knew I couldn't just start teaching it. I couldn't just begin and go to this room full of defensive, burned out people. They'd never listen to me. So I'd start by asking people if they'd had a bad customer service experience recently. Basically everyone has. And I'd just invite anyone who wanted to tell us about it. And within 10 seconds, the first hand went up, and then another hand, and then another, and another, and another. Because you know what? Everyone has been hurt as a customer before. And the stories came out, and the emotions came out, and people were laughing, and then they were crying, and they were talking about ways that bad customer service had hurt them and humiliated them and affected every part of their life, their health, their families, their kids, their self-confidence. And this was true not only when they were the customer in bad interactions, but when they were the worker who was maybe part of creating that bad interaction. It hurts both people, even when it's caused by just one of the people. The worker or the customer can cause it, and both are affected. So then I'd ask them, have you had any good customer service experiences lately? And how did that affect you? And these amazing stories would come out of incredible kindness, generosity, lives being changed, one life actually being saved, just like miracles. And then there'd be more laughter, more tears. And I'd ask them, when you're the person delivering customer service, If you could design all the days that you're going to be working in your life, would it be worth studying and practicing how you can deliver that good customer experience, not just for the customer, but for yourself? And everybody had this beautiful aha moment that customer service interactions are not this time like outside your life while you're just at work. This is a time, it's very much part of your life where you meet another human being and have the opportunity to help them feel seen and appreciated and cared for. And that is what everybody wants. And we give that to each other at the post office. We do it on the phone when we're, trying to keep our bill from being shut off. We do it at the doctor's office. And yes, even with your mobile phone service provider, even them. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge how hard it's been for me at times to stay regulated in customer service interactions. I have a history of trauma already. And that can make me feel really triggered when I get treated like I'm dumb, and when I'm trying to get a problem solved and they're ma'aming me, saying, "Ma'am, you're going to have to really calm down." Well, then I really can't calm down. And by the way, if you think that you get dysregulated, you can take my dysregulation quiz. There is a link to it below in the description section. I have it under almost every video, but it's definitely under this one. Staying regulated is especially hard in customer service situations where things are going wrong, but you have no choice but to get through it because you need that product or service or solution, and you just have to put up with any kind of bad treatment that they care to dish out. That is triggering. I'm talking about the person who puts you on hold for 45 minutes and then disconnects your call, or the healthcare front desk worker who makes you say why you're visiting the doctor, like right in front of 20 people in the waiting room, or the government office that requires you to wait for 4 hours in a dirty room to even find out that you didn't bring the right paperwork and they're rude. The manager, right, who comes out and tells you again, "Ma'am, calm down." You can tell, I really don't like that one. These experiences can feel demeaning, they're infuriating, they're unjust, and they can tap into deep parts of your old trauma, which is stuff you can't even connect to a specific experience necessarily in the past, but now, in the moment, it's coming out like lava inside, like an emotional flashback. It's a feeling of overwhelm, a feeling like you need to get out of there, or you need to express that anger that's coming up inside you. And you see sometimes as it's coming out, you see in other people's faces how it's affecting them. I don't know about you, but that's like a feeling of shame where, the feeling is really strong coming out. These are CPTSD reactions, and yes, they can be triggered by bad customer service. And I know a lot of you are nodding your heads right now thinking about some doozies of bad customer service you've had happen to you. And a lot of you are nodding too because you've been a service worker. Most of us have at one point or another, or you are right now, and you're going through this right now. Because it works both ways, right? Part of what's happening in a bad customer service interaction is that the people working in these roles can feel just as threatened by the customer's power as the customer does by the worker's power. Now, you may not feel like you have power as a customer, but the people who take jobs in customer service where, because of factors they can't always control, can also feel helpless in these situations. Well, in some organizations, these folks are encountering frustrated customers and getting yelled at all day. Have you ever had a job like that? And they also have a high probability of coming from a history of trauma. So to answer phones all day from angry customers, you'd almost have to have superpowers of dissociation that would allow you to just kind of like, check out and tolerate that kind of interaction, and getting hung up on, getting screamed at, or getting blamed or threatened that the customer is calling the manager and demanding that you be fired. Now, most customer service interactions are pretty good. Honestly, we can be grateful for that, but oh my gosh, when it's bad, it's so very bad. And if you have CPTSD, a bad interaction can trigger dysregulation in you that lasts, for hours or days sometimes. Like a really bad interaction could cost me 3 days. I wouldn't be able to work very well or focus. It'd be almost like being sick. And that happening, if you don't have any way to sort of change that or control it, it can hold you back. It can keep you down professionally and as a person. And I'm torn apart when I see that. So many people are carrying trauma. And when one person's trauma gets set off, it easily spreads to the other person and then another and another. And, we're more connected than we realize sometimes, for better or for worse. Our nervous systems, our hearts, our emotions can be so tender. So we protect ourselves. We fight, we put up a wall. And that's why customer service interactions can be like this horrible mosh pit of aggression. But they can also provide opportunities for extraordinary human kindness and connection. It sometimes only takes one person, could be the worker, could be the customer, to turn it around. And it's worth being that person because why? Because even when you're on the phone with the gas company, even when you're at work at a job that's not so great, this is a day in your life. And no matter how trivial the task at hand is, there can be meaning in it because of the way that you're going to affect that other person who's there with you.